Ask 10 people to name a country that makes computer chips and most of them will say Taiwan. A few might say South Korea. Statistically, none of them will say Malaysia. And yet last year, roughly 1 out of every 8 semiconductors assembled, tested, and packaged anywhere on Earth passed through Malaysian hands first, before it ever reached the phone, the car, or the data center it was built for. Footnote 1. That is not a rounding error. That is a choke point nobody's watching. Malaysia isn't alone. Scattered across the map are a handful of countries just like it, small on a GDP chart, enormous inside a supply chain most people have never had a reason to think about. Between them, they can decide whether a $1 trillion AI buildout gets the parts it needs, whether an EV battery gets built, and whether a cargo ship carrying half the world's fuel gets where it's going on time. This episode names them. Here's what a supply chain choke point actually is, mechanically, not the biggest link in the chain but the scarcest one, the single point where output can't be substituted, rerouted, or replaced quickly enough to matter when something goes wrong. Malaysia's version of this leverage doesn't come from designing chips or fabricating the silicon wafer itself. That work still belongs mostly to Taiwan and, downstream, the Netherlands equipment monopoly this series already covered in episodes 14 and 15. Malaysia's leverage sits one step later in a less glamorous process called assembly, testing, and packaging, the stage that takes a finished chip and turns it into something a device can actually use. Malaysia currently handles about 13% of the world's output in this category, making it the 6th largest semiconductor exporter on Earth, built on a 50-year-old industrial base most of the world has simply stopped noticing. Footnote 2. Here's the twist that makes this episode's timing matter. That 13% is the old kind of leverage, reliable but low margin and easy for a competitor to eventually replicate. The leverage racing to matter right now is different. AI accelerators, the chips inside every data center this series has already spent an episode on, require a newer process called advanced packaging, which stacks memory, logic, and compute into a single integrated unit instead of housing one chip alone. It's the only way to build the kind of chip NVIDIA and its competitors now need, and it commands gross margins of 40 to 50%, more than double the traditional kind. Footnote 3. In May 2026, a consortium of 5 Malaysian companies launched with government backing, aiming to capture 7% of this specific market by 2035, explicitly framed in the government's own language as reducing the world's Taiwan-concentrated dependence for the chips the entire AI build-out runs on. Footnote 4. Put plainly, Malaysia isn't just sitting on old leverage. It's trying to manufacture new leverage, on purpose, aimed directly at the exact choke point episode 19 already showed you the world is racing to secure. Here's the contrasting pair, and it isn't the leverage Malaysia has, it's the gap between the leverage it has and the leverage it wants. As of this year, Malaysia's own advanced packaging consortium describes itself as holding zero position in the higher value segment of the industry it's trying to break into, a country handling 13% of the world's conventional packaging volume, starting from scratch in the one category that actually matters for AI. Footnote 5. The global advanced packaging market itself was worth roughly $51.6 billion in 2025 and is forecast to nearly double by 2031. Footnote 6. Malaysia is racing to grab a single-digit slice of a market it currently has no meaningful foothold in at all, and doing it anyway because the alternative is watching that leverage concentrate somewhere else entirely. Malaysia is the anchor of this episode, but it isn't the only country worth naming, and a few others deserve their moment, even without the full case study treatment. The Democratic Republic of Congo controls more than 70% of the world's cobalt supply, the material inside nearly every lithium-ion battery on Earth, and in February 2025 imposed a months-long export ban simply to manage its own oversupply and prop up falling prices. Footnote 7. A single country acting entirely in its own domestic interest, briefly restricted a mineral the global EV and battery industry cannot function without. Indonesia holds more than 60% of the world's nickel supply, and cut its 2026 mining quotas for the same reason the DRC did, not coercion, just ordinary domestic price management that happens to ripple through every battery manufacturer on the planet. Footnote 9. And then there's Panama, genuinely small, genuinely disproportionate, currently contested. In January 2026, Panama's own Supreme Court ruled that the Hong Kong-based C.K. Hutchinson's contract to operate 2 major canal port terminals was unconstitutional, under direct pressure from Washington to reassert American influence over the canal, a LiveU.S. China-Panama standoff playing out over a 51-mile strip of water that roughly 8% more global shipping traffic moved through in the first half of 2026 alone, partly rerouted from crises elsewhere in the world. Ships without a booked slot have faced waits of over 10 days. One company reportedly paid an extra $4 million rerouting a single fuel shipment around the bottleneck. Footnote 9. For countries. None of them among the world's 10 largest economies. All four, right now, holding a piece of leverage the rest of the world genuinely cannot route around. A note on scope. This episode is deliberately not covering maritime shipping lane choke points tied to the current Strait of Hormuz crisis. The Panama Canal case above is about corporate and legal control, not the active war reshaping Middle Eastern shipping lanes. That subject is significant enough and sensitive enough to warrant its own dedicated episode rather than a rushed mention here. The apparent fixes exist and each one gets tried in some form somewhere. Western governments are funding new mining and refining capacity outside China. The U.S. State Department's February 2026 Critical Minerals Ministerial produced 11 new bilateral supply frameworks signed by 54 nations in a single event. Footnote 10. Companies are diversifying suppliers, building strategic stockpiles, and, in Malaysia's case, an entire country is trying to build brand new leverage from a standing start specifically to avoid being locked out of the next choke point. All reasonable. None of it fast. Here's why. Every one of these fixes takes years to build, and the leverage being contested changes hands in months. A mining and refining project takes the better part of a decade to reach real production volume. Advanced packaging capability, per Malaysia's own government, takes until 2035 to reach a single-digit share of the market. 9 years for 7%. Meanwhile, the actors already holding the leverage can restrict, quota, or legally contest access in a single fiscal quarter, the way the DRC, Indonesia, and Panama's courts all just did. That's the actual locked room, and it isn't shaped like any of this series' previous 12 variants. Nobody built this choke point out of malice and nobody's defending it out of greed. Global supply chains concentrated this way on purpose decades ago because concentration is what made everything cheaper. One country doing assembly and testing at scale beats 15 countries doing it redundantly and expensively. That was the actual bargain, and for decades, it worked exactly as intended. Now undoing that concentration means asking the entire global economy to deliberately pay more, for years, for a form of security nobody notices they're missing until the exact moment they need it. Every door has a locked room behind it. This one wasn't built to trap anyone. It was built on purpose because it made the world's electronics cheaper for 30 straight years. And now taking it apart means asking someone to volunteer to pay the bill for a problem that, until this year, nobody they know experienced firsthand. Every one of these four countries is, in its own way, quietly setting a price the rest of the world will eventually pay. The DRC and Indonesia can already move global commodity prices with a single quota decision. Panama can add 10 days and millions of dollars to a shipment with a single court ruling. And Malaysia, if its bet on advanced packaging pays off, will have real pricing power over the AI chips this series has already shown you are being funded ahead of American workers' own jobs. None of that cost stays contained to the countries or the companies involved. It moves downstream, into every product with a chip in it, and eventually into every price tag attached to those products. Memory chips are already up 80 to 90% in a single year, and that was before any of these four countries fully exercised the leverage this episode just laid out. Which is exactly where this series goes next. If a handful of countries most people couldn't name can already move the price of a battery, a canal transit, or a chip, what happens to everyone downstream once that leverage gets fully priced in across every industry that depends on a chip, a battery, or a shipping lane to function at all? Here's the whole argument in one sentence. The world spent 30 years building a global economy on the assumption that a handful of small, quiet countries would keep doing the unglamorous work cheaply and reliably forever, and 2026 is the year several of them, independently and for their own entirely legitimate reasons, decided that assumption was never actually a guarantee. Nobody colluded. Nobody needs to. Leverage this concentrated doesn't require a conspiracy to matter. It just requires one country on one ordinary Tuesday, deciding its own interests come first. The bill for that concentration hasn't arrived yet. But it's already being calculated, one quota, one court ruling, one shortage at a time, And next, this series follows it all the way to the price tag.